The air in Redemption Gulch was thick enough to taste, a bitter cocktail of dust fear and last night's cheap whiskey. For a young woman named Elspeth Hayes, it was the taste of the end. Cornered in a dusty alley, with her back against the rough-hewn planks of the general store, she faced the man who held the deed to her life. With nothing left to bargain, and nowhere left to run, she looked past his leering face to the silent, imposing figure who had just ridden into town. A man whose reputation was as hard and unforgiving as the Arizona Territory itself. Her voice, barely a tremor, broke the silence. "Please, just make it quick," she whispered. But the rancher, Josiah Blackwood, was about to do the unthinkable. The sun beat down on Redemption Gulch with a merciless white-hot intensity, baking the very soul out of the land. It was a miserable place on a good day. Today, for Elspeth Hayes, it was the final circle of hell. Her father, William Hayes, had been a man full of dreams of silver veins and sprawling ranches, but he died with dust in his lungs and debt as his only legacy. That debt had a name, Bartholomew Thorne. Thorne stood before her, now a man whose physical softness belied the jagged cruelty of his spirit. His vested suit, too fine for this dusty purgatory, was stretched taut over a paunch fed by the misfortunes of others. Two of his hired guns, brutish men, named Finch and Gatlin, flanked him, their hands resting on their holstered pistols with a practiced laziness that was more menacing than any overt threat. "The bill has come due, my dear Elspeth Thorne," said his voice, a greasy purr. He produced a sheaf of papers from his inner coat pocket. "Your father, bless his ambitious heart, signed over everything. The claim worthless, the cabin barely standing, and as collateral of last resort." He paused, letting his gaze crawl over her. "You." Elspeth's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her worn calico dress, patched and faded, felt like a shroud. "My father was a desperate man. You preyed on him." Thorne chuckled a low, unpleasant sound. "Business is predation, my child. The wolf and the lamb. Your father was regrettably the lamb. Now the debt must be honored. You'll come with me. I have a position for you at my establishment in Prescott. A girl with your spirit will be very popular." The unspoken meaning hung in the air, thick and suffocating. He wasn't offering her a job as a laundress. Finch and Gatlin shifted their grins, revealing yellowed teeth. This was it. The end of her world. There was no one to help her. Sheriff Brody was a man who knew which side his bread was buttered on, and it was always Thorne's. It was in that moment of absolute despair that a shadow fell over them. The shadow belonged to a man on a formidable black stallion, a horse so large and powerful it seemed carved from obsidian. The rider was just as imposing. Josiah Blackwood, owner of the sprawling Blackwood Sterling Ranch, sat astride his horse, with the stillness of a predator. He was a man forged from the harsh realities of the West, his face a road map of sun and sorrow, his eyes the color of a stormy sky. The townsfolk whispered that he hadn't smiled since his wife and child were taken by the fever 5 years prior. He was a man of few words and decisive, often brutal action. He dismounted, in a single fluid motion, the jingle of his spurs the only sound in the suddenly silent alley. He didn't look at Elspeth. His gaze was fixed on Thorne. Blackwood Thorne greeted his oily confidence, wavering ever so slightly. An unexpected pleasure. Come to collect on the beef contract, something like that. Josiah's voice was a low baritone, like rocks grinding together. It carried an authority that Thorne's money couldn't buy. "I hear you're settling the Hayes account." Indeed, Thorne puffed out his chest. "A sad affair, but a debt is a debt." Josiah's eyes finally flickered to Elspeth. She saw no pity in them, no hint of salvation. It was the detached, appraising look a rancher gives a piece of livestock. She felt a new, colder wave of fear. Perhaps he was a partner of Thorne's. Perhaps he was here to claim his share. Her resolve crumbled, leaving only a raw, pleading instinct for the end. She looked directly at the grim rancher, the man who seemed to hold all the power in this wretched alley. "Please," she whispered the words catching in her throat, a prayer to a merciless God. "Just make it quick." Finch and Gatlin snickered. Thorne's smile widened triumphant. He believed she was speaking to him, begging for a swift journey into servitude. But Josiah Blackwood's gaze never left hers. A muscle twitched in his jaw. The silence stretched tight as a bowstring. Then he did the unthinkable. He turned his full attention back to Thorne, his voice cutting through the oppressive heat. "What's the price on the girl?" Thorne blinked, momentarily confused. She's not for sale. She's collateral. Payment in kind." "Everything has a price," Thorne Josiah stated, not asked. He reached into the saddlebag on his horse and pulled out a heavy leather pouch. He tossed it onto a nearby rain barrel. It landed with a solid, definitive thud that echoed the finality of a gavel. "That's $500 in gold coin. That covers William Hayes's debt with interest. I have the bank draft for the rest of his obligations at my solicitor's office. The account is settled." Thorne stared at the pouch, his greed warring with his wounded pride. $500 was more than the debt was worth, and far more than he'd ever make from Elspeth, but to be so publicly overruled. "Now, Blackwood, this is a private matter." He began trying to regain control. Josiah took a single step forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "The matter is closed. The debt is paid. The girl is with me." It was a declaration, not a negotiation. Finch and Gatlin, who had looked so menacing moments before, now seemed to shrink. They knew Josiah Blackwood's reputation. He wasn't a man to be trifled with. Thorne, ever the pragmatist, saw the gold on the barrel and the steel in Blackwood's eyes. He forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Of course, if you wish to be so charitable. A settled account is a settled account," he gestured to his men. "Finch, Gatlin, we have other business." He shot a venomous glare at Elspeth, a look that promised this was far from over, before turning and striding out of the alley, his hired guns trailing behind him like curs. Elspeth stood frozen, her mind reeling. She wasn't saved. She was sold. She had simply been traded from one owner to another. She looked at Josiah Blackwood, the grim-faced rancher, who had just purchased her, as easily as he would a horse or a side of beef. His stormy eyes met hers, and in their depths she saw not kindness, but a cold, unreadable resolve. "Come," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. He gestured toward his horse. Her legs, weak and trembling, finally obeyed. She had escaped Bartholomew Thorne only to be claimed by the formidable enigma of Josiah Blackwood. She didn't know if she had been rescued or merely delivered to a different, more isolated cage. As she walked towards the black stallion, the dust of Redemption Gulch swirling around her feet, she knew one thing for certain: her life was no longer her own. The ride to the Blackwood Sterling Ranch was a blur of sun-scorched earth and suffocating silence. Elspeth sat sideways behind Josiah on the great black stallion, her hands clutching tentatively at the back of the saddle, careful not to touch the man himself. He rode with an unyielding straightness, a silent monolith who smelled of leather dust, and something else, a deep, abiding loneliness she could almost feel radiating from him, like heat from a blacksmith's forge. They passed through a valley carved between two mesas, and the land opened up to reveal the ranch. It was less a homestead and more a small kingdom. A 2-story ranch house built of dark, sturdy timber and river stone stood as the centerpiece, flanked by the largest barn she had ever seen, a web of corrals, a bunkhouse, and various outbuildings. It was prosperous, powerful, and utterly intimidating. This was Josiah Blackwood's domain, and she was now just a piece of his property within it. As they rode into the main yard, ranch hands stopped their work to stare. Their faces were a mixture of curiosity and undisguised shock. They saw their stoic, solitary boss riding in with a young woman, a disheveled, terrified young woman, and the questions were plain on every face. An older man, with a weathered face and a slight limp, detached himself from a group mending a fence and approached them. His eyes, a surprisingly sharp blue, took in the scene with a practiced glance. "Josiah," he said, his voice raspy from years of dust and shouting over cattle. Amos Josiah acknowledged, swinging down from the horse. He then turned and without a word offered a hand to help Elspeth down. His grip was firm and impersonal, his touch sending a jolt of alarm through her. She scrambled to the ground, pulling her hand back as if burned. Amos looked from his boss to Elspeth, his brow furrowed. "Trouble in town business?" Josiah replied curtly. He turned to a stout, grey-haired woman who had emerged from the ranch house, wiping her hands on her apron. "Martha, this is Elspeth Hayes. She'll be staying with us. Get her settled in the east guest room. Find her some suitable clothes." Martha, whose face held a stern but not unkind expression, nodded slowly, her eyes full of the same unanswered questions as everyone else's. "Of course, Mr. Blackwood." She gestured for Elspeth to follow her. Elspeth hesitated, looking at Josiah, searching for some explanation, some clue as to her fate. He simply met her gaze with that same unreadable, stony expression. "Go on," he said, his tone dismissing her. He then turned back to his foreman. "Amos, I want riders on the north pasture. Thorne's been getting bold. I want a watch on the wells, too." As Martha led her toward the imposing house, Elspeth felt the weight of every stare. She was an anomaly, a disruption to the harsh, masculine order of this place. The ranch house was surprisingly fine inside, with polished wood floors, sturdy furniture, and a quiet, somber air. It was clean and well kept, but lacked any warmth or personal touch. It was the house of a man who had forgotten what a home was supposed to feel like. Martha showed her to a room upstairs that was larger than the entire cabin she had shared with her father. It had a proper bed with a thick quilt, a washstand with a porcelain basin, and a window that looked out over the vast, rolling plains of the ranch. It was beautiful, but it felt like a cage, a well-appointed, gilded cage. "I'll fetch you a bath and some food," Martha said, her voice softer now that they were alone. "You look like you've been through a war, child." Tears pricked Elspeth's eyes, but she fought them back. She would not show weakness. "What does he want from me?" she asked, her voice a hoarse whisper. Martha sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "I've been housekeeper for Josiah Blackwood for 10 years. I was here when his Mary was alive, and their little boy. After he lost them, he closed a door inside himself. I don't pretend to know what goes on in his head. But he's not a cruel man, child. He's a hard man, but not cruel." The distinction was lost on Elspeth. Hardness and cruelty felt one and the same right now. Later that evening, after a hot bath and a simple meal, she barely touched, there was a knock on her door. It was Josiah. He stood in the hallway, filling the frame, his shadow stretching long into her room. "I trust you're settled," he said. It wasn't a question. "Why am I here?" she asked directly, her fear giving way to a desperate need for answers. "You paid my father's debt. Am I to be your servant? To work it off?" He was silent for a long moment, studying her as if she were a complex puzzle. "No," he said, finally. "You won't be a servant." "Then what? What do you want from me?" He took a step into the room, and the space suddenly felt much smaller. "Bartholomew Thorne is not a man who forgives a slight. By taking you from him, I've made an enemy of him. He believes you belong to him. He will try to get you back, not because he wants you, but because he can't stand to lose. So you'll just keep me here. A prisoner. You will be protected here," he corrected her. "But that's not enough. A single woman under my roof, it will cause talk. It gives Thorne an angle to work away, to paint me as immoral, to turn the more delicate townsfolk against me. He will try to ruin my reputation, my business. There is only one way to silence the whispers and give you ironclad protection under the law." He looked at her, his stormy eyes holding a glint of something she couldn't decipher. It looked like grim, painful necessity. It was then that Josiah Blackwood did the second, and far more shocking, unthinkable thing. Tomorrow morning, he announced, his voice flat and devoid of any emotion, "We will ride back to town. We will see Judge Miller. You and I are to be married." The world tilted on its axis. Elspeth stared at him, speechless. Of all the possibilities she had imagined, servitude, indenturement, a life as a kept woman, this was the one thing that had never entered her mind. Marriage. A sacrament. A sacred vow. And he spoke of it like a business merger, a strategic move in a war against another man. Marriage, she finally choked out the word, tasting like ash. "You can't be serious. We don't know each other. This is insane." "It is practical," he countered, his voice unbending. "As my wife, you will be untouchable. Legally, you are Mrs. Josiah Blackwood. No one, not even Thorne, can lay a claim on you. Your safety will be absolute. My reputation will be secure. It is the only logical solution." "Logical?" she cried, a hysterical laugh bubbling in her chest. "There is nothing logical about this. You bought me like a brood mare, and now you mean to brand me. I will not do it." His expression hardened, the faint glint of whatever emotion she'd seen vanishing completely, replaced by cold steel. "You mistake your position, Miss Hayes. I am not asking you. I am telling you. You can be Mrs. Blackwood, safe and provided for under this roof, or you can take your chances with Thorne. The choice is yours, but I suspect it's no choice at all." He turned and left, closing the door softly behind him, leaving her in the cavernous, silent room. The gilded cage now had a name: matrimony. She was trapped, bound not by chains, but by a vow she would be forced to make. She had whispered for a quick end in that alley, and instead, Josiah Blackwood had given her a life sentence. The wedding was a travesty of the sacred. It took place not in a church, but in the dusty, book-lined office of Judge Miller, a man whose weary eyes had seen too much of the territory's raw bargains to be shocked by this one. Josiah stood beside her, rigid and unmoving as a statue, his best dark coat, doing little to soften his forbidding presence. Elspeth wore a simple blue dress Martha had found for her, a garment that felt like a costume for a play she never wished to be in. Amos and a reluctant Sheriff Brodie served as witnesses, their discomfort palpable in the stuffy room. Judge Miller mumbled the words, his voice droning on, stripping the ceremony of all meaning and grace. When it came time for the vows, Elspeth's voice was a barely audible whisper. She felt Josiah's gaze on her, intense and demanding, and she forced the words out. "I do." They felt like a lie, a betrayal of every girlish dream she had ever harbored, of love and partnership. Josiah's "I do" was a firm, resonant declaration that echoed in the small office. It was the sound of a deal being sealed, a contract being signed. He slid a simple, unadorned gold band onto her finger. It felt heavy, cold, and foreign. There was no kiss. There were no congratulations. Just the scratching of the judge's pen on the marriage certificate, the final nail in the coffin of her old life. Back at the ranch, a strange new reality set in. Josiah moved her belongings from the guest room to the master bedroom. His bedroom. The room was starkly masculine, dominated by a large, dark wood bed. It held the faint, lingering scent of the lavender his late wife, Mary, had apparently favored a ghostly presence that made Elspeth feel like an intruder. To her immense relief, Josiah unrolled a bedroll and placed it on the floor at the foot of the bed. "This is your room," he stated, leaving no room for discussion. "I will not trouble you. This is for appearances, for your protection. Nothing more." Days bled into weeks. Elspeth lived in a state of suspended animation, a ghost in her own life. She was the mistress of a great ranch, yet she had no authority. The ranch hands were polite, but distant, unsure how to treat this sudden wife of their solitary boss. Martha was her only source of quiet companionship, teaching her the rhythms of the household from baking bread to managing the larder. Elspeth, however, was not one to sit idle. Her father, for all his faults, had taught her to read and write, and more importantly, to keep meticulous accounts. One afternoon, finding herself restless and desperate for a purpose, she ventured into Josiah's office. It was his sanctuary filled with ledgers, maps, and the smell of old paper and tobacco. She expected him to be there, but it was empty. Hesitantly, she picked up the main ledger from his desk. She began to read her initial curiosity, turning into focused concentration. She saw the ranch's lifeblood in the columns of numbers: cattle sales, supply, costs, wages, profits, losses. And she saw trouble. Small but consistent discrepancies. Overpayments to a certain supplier in Prescott. Cattle counts that seemed to slightly diminish between the pasture tallies and the final sale numbers. It was subtle, the work of a patient thief. It was the kind of thing Thorne would do, not a direct assault, but a slow bleeding. She was so engrossed she didn't hear him enter. "What are you doing?" Josiah's voice, sharp and accusatory, made her jump. She spun around, the heavy ledger still in her hands. I was just looking." He strode forward and took the book from her, his face a mask of anger. "This is my office. My business. It does not concern you." The injustice of his tone, after everything she had endured, ignited a spark of defiance in her. "Doesn't it?" She shot back, her voice, trembling but firm. "You made me your wife to protect your reputation and your assets. It seems to me that makes it very much my concern, especially when someone is stealing from you." His anger faltered, replaced by a flicker of surprise. "What are you talking about?" "Look here," she said, boldly pointing to a page. "The freight costs from the Barstow line. You paid them twice last month. And here the tally for the last drive to Tucson. Amos's count was 2,050 head. The final sale document from the stockyard only accounts for 2,020. 30 head of cattle don't just vanish, Josiah. Not unless someone is helping them." He stared at the pages, then back at her, a new, calculating light in his eyes. He had seen her as a liability to be managed, a problem to be solved. He had never considered she might be an asset. That night, the silence at their dinner table was different. It was less a void, and more a space filled with unspoken thoughts. After the meal, as she was preparing to retreat to their room, he stopped her. "My wife. Mary." He began the name, sounding rusty on his tongue. She was from the East. She never understood this life. She hated the dust, the heat, the loneliness. She tried, but this land broke her spirit long before the fever took her. Elspeth listened, stunned by this crack in his armor. "My boy Thomas." He was only 4. He had her smile. He looked away out the window into the encroaching darkness. After they were gone, I made a vow to myself. Never again. Never let anyone close enough to hurt. Never be responsible for anyone else's heart. He turned back to her, his gaze intense, searching. I didn't save you in that alley out of charity, Elspeth. Thorne mentioned your father's name, William Hayes. You knew my father. She asked, her heart beginning to pound. A long time ago, before I had this ranch, I was just a young man working a silver claim up in the Bradshaw Mountains. I was caught in a flash flood, pinned by a timber drowning. A prospector I barely knew risked his own life to drag me out. He saved me from certain death. Josiah's voice was low, thick with a memory he had clearly carried for years. That man was your father. I owed him a debt I could never repay. A life for a life. The room spun. This wasn't a business transaction. It wasn't a strategic move against Thorne. It was the repayment of the most sacred debt of all. He hadn't bought her. He had honored her father. Why didn't you tell me? She whispered, tears welling in her eyes. Because it wasn't your debt to carry, he said, his voice rough with emotion. And because telling you would have made this personal. I wanted it to be a transaction. It was simpler that way. Safer. But it wasn't simple anymore. The cold, loveless marriage, the gilded cage, the silent arrangement, it had all been built on a foundation of profound, hidden honor. The gold band on her finger suddenly felt less like the brand of an owner and more like the symbol of a life debt, a connection that bound them together far more deeply than Judge Miller's mumbled words ever could. In his attempt to keep things impersonal, Josiah Blackwood had revealed a secret that changed everything. The revelation of Josiah's life debt to her father shifted the very ground beneath Elspeth's feet. The ranch no longer felt like a prison, but a complicated sanctuary. The man who shared her room was no longer a captor, but a guardian bound by a ghost's promise. A fragile, unspoken truce grew between them, woven from shared meals, quiet evenings, and the mutual threat that loomed over them. Elspeth's discovery in the ledgers had earned her a new grudging respect from Josiah. He began to discuss the ranch's business with her, spreading maps and tally sheets on the dining table after the evening meal. Her sharp mind, accustomed to making sense of her father's chaotic finances, quickly became an invaluable tool. She identified the slow drain of resources as the work of Bartholomew Thorne, a campaign of 1,000 cuts designed to weaken the Blackwood Sterling Ranch until it was vulnerable to a takeover. He's paying someone on the inside, she insisted one evening, tapping a finger on a provision manifest. Someone who can alter the tallies and approve the false invoices. It has to be. Josiah's jaw was tight. My men are loyal. Loyalty can be bought, she countered softly. Or it can be broken. The threat did not remain confined to paper. Thorne, infuriated by the marriage that had legitimized Josiah's claim on Elspeth, escalated his attacks. A small herd of prize-breeding cattle was rustled from a remote pasture. A fire started under the cover of darkness, consumed a hayrick before the ranch hands could extinguish it. Each incident was a message, a reminder of Thorne's reach and malice. The tension culminated in a confrontation in Redemption Gulch. Josiah and Elspeth had ridden to town for supplies, a rare trip together that felt unnervingly domestic. As they were leaving the mercantile, Thorne and his goons, Finch and Gatlin, blocked their path on the boardwalk. Mrs. Blackwood Thorne sneered, his eyes filled with possessive venom as he looked at Elspeth. Marriage seems to agree with you, though I confess I pictured you in finer accommodations than a dusty ranch house. My accommodations are my own business, Mr. Thorne. Elspeth replied, her voice steady, despite the frantic beating of her heart. She stood closer to Josiah, feeling the protective shield of his presence. "Is that so?" Thorne's gaze shifted to Josiah. "You think your little legal maneuver protects you, Blackwood. This territory doesn't run on paper. It runs on power, and you are losing it." "Get out of my way, Thorne." Josiah said, his voice dangerously low. Finch, emboldened by his boss, took a step forward. "Or what, rancher?" Before Josiah could even react, a figure shot out from the side. It was Amos, the grizzled foreman who had followed them into town. "You heard the boss," Amos growled, placing himself between them. Gatlin, the other thug, didn't hesitate. He swung a heavy fist, catching Amos on the side of the head. The older man staggered, and in the ensuing scuffle, Finch drew his pistol. The street exploded into chaos. Josiah shoved Elspeth behind him, drawing his own Colt with a speed that was terrifyingly fast. A shot rang out not from Josiah, but from Sheriff Brody, who had finally been forced to intervene. "That's enough!" Brody yelled, his pistol pointed at the sky. The fight dissolved as quickly as it began. Amos was on the ground, clutching a bleeding arm where Gatlin had used a knife. Thorne, ever the coward, held up his hands in a gesture of mock innocence. "A simple misunderstanding, Sheriff." Josiah ignored him, kneeling beside his foreman. The wound was deep. As they helped Amos to the doctor's office, Elspeth saw the look in Josiah's eyes. It was a cold, murderous fury he was barely holding in check. This was no longer about business or stolen cattle. Thorne had drawn blood from his family. That night, the atmosphere in the ranch house was thick with impending violence. Josiah cleaned his rifle with methodical, deadly precision. The lamplight caught the hard planes of his face, casting his eyes in deep shadow. He was preparing for war. Elspeth came and sat across from him, her hands clasped in her lap. "This is what he wants," she said quietly. Josiah didn't look up from his work. "He wants my ranch, my water rights. He wants you. He'll stop at nothing." "No," she insisted. "He wants you to do something rash. He wants to provoke you into a fight he can win. If you ride out with your men seeking revenge, he'll have the law and a dozen hired guns waiting for you. He'll paint you as the aggressor. He wants to break you. Josiah, not just fight you." He finally stopped looking at her. "So we do nothing. Let him cut us to pieces. One fence post, one steer at a time." "We don't fight his fight," she said, leaning forward. "We fight ours. He's a businessman, a predator like you said. His strength is in money and manipulation. His weakness is that he's not a rancher. He doesn't understand the land, and he doesn't understand loyalty." A plan began to form in her mind, born of desperation and the stories her father used to tell. My father, he prospected all over this territory. He knew every canyon, every dry wash, every hidden spring. He once told me about a path through the Crimson Peaks, one that's not on any map. An old Apache trail. It's treacherous, but it cuts 2 days off the journey to the railhead at Maricopa. Josiah's attention was now fully on her. The cattle drive to Maricopa was their most important source of income, and the trail they used was vulnerable to Thorne's ambushes. "We can't move the whole herd that way," he said, thinking aloud. "It's too rough." "No," she agreed. "But you could move a small prime selection of your best cattle, enough to fulfill your most important contract. You could leave while Thorne's men are watching the main trail. You'd be gone and back before he even knew you'd left. It would fulfill your contract, bring in the money you need to survive the winter, and make him look like a fool." He looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time she saw a flicker of something beyond respect or duty. It was admiration. He saw not just the woman he was protecting, but a partner, a strategist. But as they planned, a more immediate danger was closing in. One of Thorne's men, A ranch hand named Peterson, whose gambling debts had made him vulnerable, had been feeding information to his true master. He knew Josiah was on the verge of discovering the treachery in the ledgers. Thorne, realizing his slow campaign was failing, decided on a final desperate gambit. He didn't just want to ruin Josiah Blackwood. He wanted to eliminate him and reclaim his prize, Elspeth. A few nights later, under the sliver of a new moon, a dozen riders approached the Blackwood Sterling Ranch. They did not ride to the main gate. They moved with a sinister silence through the surrounding hills, their target not the barn or the cattle, but the ranch house itself. Thorne was done with whispers. The time had come for gun smoke. The attack came without warning. The first sound was the shattering of glass as the living room window exploded inward, followed instantly by the deafening roar of a shotgun. Elspeth, who had been dozing in a chair while Josiah finalized the route on his map, screamed as splinters flew across the room. Josiah reacted with the instinct of a man long acquainted with violence. He threw himself across the table, knocking Elspeth and her chair to the floor and shielding her with his body as another blast tore through the space where she had just been sitting. "Stay down!" He roared, his Colt already in his hand. Gunshots erupted from all sides of the house. Bullets thudded into the thick timber walls. This wasn't a raid, it was an execution. Thorne's men were surrounding them, intent on leaving no one alive. From the bunkhouse, the loyal ranch hands, roused by the gunfire, began to return fire, but they were pinned down, unable to reach the main house. Amos, his arm in a sling, directed their defense, his shouts barely audible over the din. "They're trying to flush us out!" Josiah yelled to Elspeth over the cacophony. He crawled toward the fireplace, grabbing the Spencer rifle mounted above the mantel. He tossed a box of cartridges to her. "Load this. Keep loading." Her hands trembled, but she did as she was told, her mind numb with terror. She fumbled with the heavy brass cartridges, her fingers clumsy, but the simple repetitive task focused her. Josiah took up a position by a side window, shattering the remaining glass with the butt of his rifle and returning fire with deadly methodical precision. Each shot was answered by a cry of pain or a curse from the darkness outside. The siege dragged on for what felt like an eternity. The air grew thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder. One of Thorne's men, bolder than the rest, tried to break through the back door. Elspeth saw the door splintering and, without thinking, grabbed the heavy iron poker from the fireplace. As the door burst open and a shadowy figure lunged in, she swung it with all her might, connecting with the man's head with a sickening crack. He crumpled to the floor, groaning. Josiah glanced over his eyes, widening for a fraction of a second before he turned his attention back to the windows. The fight had forged a new primal bond between them, the bond of shared survival. Slowly, the coordinated assault began to falter. Josiah's lethal accuracy from the house and the determined resistance from Amos and the bunkhouse crew were taking their toll. The attackers' hired guns, with no real stake in the fight beyond their pay, began to lose their nerve. Their fire became sporadic, then ceased altogether. Hoofbeats faded into the night. A tense silence fell, broken only by the crackling of a small fire where a lantern had been shot, and the distant pained groans of one of the wounded attackers outside. Josiah moved cautiously through the house, checking every window and door. They're gone. For now. He came back to where Elspeth knelt beside the man she had struck. She was shaking uncontrollably, the adrenaline leaving her weak and nauseous. Josiah gently took the poker from her hands. He looked not at the downed man, but at her. "You did good," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. He knelt and checked the attacker. "He's alive. We'll tie him up. He might tell us something." But as they secured the wounded gunman, Elspeth's mind was racing. This wasn't just about the ranch anymore. Thorne's attack was too ferocious, too final. He wanted them dead. Why ruining Josiah was one thing, but a massacre that would bring marshals down from Prescott was another level of desperation. "It's not just about the debt," she said, aloud, her voice trembling. "It's not about me, not really. There's something else." Her thoughts flew back to her father, to his last months, when he was consumed by a feverish paranoia, muttering about Thorne, about a secret about justice. He'd been sorting through his old prospecting journals, his papers, his few precious belongings. "My father," she said, her eyes wide with dawning realization. He didn't just owe Thorne money. He knew something that Thorne would kill to keep hidden. Josiah looked at her, listening intently. His journals. He was always writing. He kept everything. He had this old beat-up, leather-bound Bible. It wasn't for praying. He always said it was where he kept the things that truly mattered. The Bible had been among the few things she'd managed to grab from their cabin before fleeing to town. It was upstairs in her travel trunk. She ran, taking the stairs 2 at a time, Josiah close behind her. She threw open the trunk and pulled out the worn Bible. Its pages were filled with her father's spidery script notes, in the margins, underlines, and strange symbols. But tucked inside the back cover, in a slit cut into the leather, was a folded yellowed piece of paper. It was a sworn affidavit signed by a man named Alistair Finch, the father of Thorne's current goon, and witnessed by William Hayes. It detailed how a young Bartholomew Thorne had murdered his original partner for a rich gold claim, the very claim that had been the foundation of his entire fortune. Thorne hadn't just built his empire on debt, he'd built it on murder and theft. This document was the proof. "This is it," Elspeth whispered, her hands shaking as she held the paper. "This is why he wanted me. He wasn't just collecting collateral. He was hunting for this. He thought my father had told me where it was." Suddenly, a floorboard creaked behind them. They spun around. Standing in the doorway, his face pale and sweating, was Peterson, the ranch hand, whose loyalty had been bought. In his hand was a pistol, and it was pointed straight at Elspeth. "Give it to me," Peterson stammered, his eyes darting nervously between them and the affidavit. "Thorne's waiting down the road. He said to get the paper and the girl. He said he'd forgive my debt." "Don't be a fool, Peterson," Josiah said, stepping in front of Elspeth. "Thorne won't forgive anything. He'll put a bullet in you the second you're no longer useful." "I have no choice," Peterson cried, his voice cracking. Behind him in the hallway, a shadow moved. It was Martha, the housekeeper, holding a heavy cast-iron skillet. With a cry of fury, she swung it with all her might, bringing it down on the back of Peterson's head. He collapsed like a sack of grain. But the commotion had been a fatal distraction. A new figure appeared in the doorway, stepping over Peterson's unconscious form. It was Bartholomew Thorne himself, his fine suit smudged with dirt, his face contorted in a mask of manic rage. In his hand, a derringer gleamed. "Impressive." Thorne sneered, his eyes locking onto the paper in Elspeth's hand. "All this trouble for a piece of paper. Give it to me, my dear. Give it to me, and I'll let your rancher friend live." Josiah pushed Elspeth behind him, his body a shield. "It's over, Thorne. It's over when I say it is." Thorne shrieked, his composure shattering completely. He lunged forward, not at Josiah, but at Elspeth, grabbing her and pressing the cold barrel of the derringer to her temple. He held the affidavit in his other hand. "I have the proof and I have the girl. Now, Blackwood, drop your gun, or I'll scatter her pretty brains all over this room." Josiah froze his face, a canvas of pure agony. He was helpless. After all his planning, all his fighting, it had come down to this. Thorne had him. But Thorne had made one critical mistake. He had backed into the hallway, pulling Elspeth with him, positioning himself directly at the top of the main staircase. and he had underestimated Elspeth Hayes. She looked at Josiah at the terror and rage in his eyes, and a cold calm washed over her. She would not be a victim. She would not be a pawn. With a sudden, desperate surge of strength, she stomped her heel down hard on Thorne's instep and drove her elbow back into his soft belly. He grunted in pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all she needed. She twisted, shoving him with all her might. Thorne, off balance and surprised, stumbled backward. His heel caught the edge of the top stair. His eyes widened in shock as he tumbled backward down the long, steep flight of stairs, the derringer firing harmlessly into the ceiling as he fell. He landed at the bottom with a sickening final crunch. Silence descended upon the house. Elspeth stood at the top of the stairs, breathing in ragged gasps, the damning affidavit clutched in her hand. Josiah rushed to her side, his hands hovering, not daring to touch her, his eyes scanning her for any injury. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice raw. She could only nod, leaning against the wall for support. Below them, Bartholomew Thorne lay still. His reign of terror ended, not by a hail of bullets in a gunfight, but by a desperate act of courage and a long fall. The devil had finally received his due. The silence that followed Thorne's fall was more profound than any noise that had preceded it. It was a vacuum pulling all the chaos and fear of the night into it, leaving a strange hollow peace. Downstairs, the body of Bartholomew Thorne lay broken at the foot of the stairs, a testament to his own violent ambition. Upstairs, Elspeth leaned against the wall, the damning affidavit still clutched in her hand, its crinkled paper, a fragile shield. Josiah moved toward her, his expression a mixture of awe, relief, and a terror so deep it seemed to shake his very foundation. He reached out a hand not to touch her, but as if to assure himself she was real, that she was unharmed. "Elspeth." He breathed her name, a prayer on his lips. The sun was beginning to rise, its first pale fingers stretching over the mazes, casting a soft, forgiving light into the bullet-scarred room. The new day brought with it the sound of riders approaching, not with malice, but with the steady, official cadence of the law. Sheriff Brodie, looking grim and exhausted, was accompanied by a stern-faced U.S. Marshal from Prescott, whom Amos had ridden out to fetch hours ago, predicting the night would end in blood. They surveyed the scene with practiced eyes, the dead attackers in the yard, the wounded gunman tied to a chair, the groaning traitor Peterson, and finally the architect of it all, Thorne. Elspeth, with a composure that surprised even herself, presented the affidavit to the marshal. She explained its origins clearly and concisely, her voice never wavering. She spoke of Thorne's threats, of his obsession, of the final desperate assault. The marshal, a man named Corrigan, read the document, his eyebrows rising. "William Hayes," he mused. "I remember that name. He tried to bring this story to the circuit judge years ago, but he was dismissed as a crackpot. No one would believe a penniless prospector over a man like Thorne." He looked from the paper to Elspeth and then to Josiah. "This changes a great deal. Thorne had a network built on fear. With him gone, it will collapse." The ranch became a hub of official activity, but for Elspeth and Josiah, it was a world away. They moved through the questioning and the aftermath like ghosts. By midday, the bodies were gone, the prisoners were in custody, and an unnerving quiet settled back over the Blackwood Sterling. The ranch hands worked silently, repairing the damage, their movements respectful, their glances toward Elspeth, now filled with a deep, abiding reverence. She was no longer just the boss's strange wife. She was the woman who had faced the devil and won. That evening they sat on the porch as the sky bled into shades of purple and orange. The air was cool and clean. The contract that had bound them, the threat of Bartholomew Thorne, was null and void. The silence between them was no longer one of tension or awkwardness, but of profound, unspoken gravity. Finally, Josiah cleared his throat. He stared out at the sprawling land that was his kingdom, his fortress, his prison. "The arrangement is concluded," he said, his voice low and formal, a poor shield for the emotion beneath. "You are a free woman, Elspeth. You have no obligation to stay here. I will provide you with a generous stake enough to start a new life anywhere you choose. San Francisco, back east, wherever you wish." He was offering her an escape. He was offering her the end of the transaction. Elspeth turned to look at his profile, silhouetted against the fading light. She saw the tension in his jaw, the rigid set of his shoulders. He wasn't pushing her away out of coldness. He was doing it out of fear. The fear of a man who had already lost everything once. "Is that what this was to you?" "Josiah," she asked, her voice soft but unwavering. "A transaction?" He flinched, turning to face her. In his stormy eyes, she saw a battle raging. It was what it had to be. "But it's not what it became," she countered, pressing on. "You talk of arrangements and obligations. We stood in that house last night, and we fought for our lives. Not as a rancher and his ward, not as parties to a contract. We fought as a family fights." The word hung in the air between them. Family. The one thing he had sworn he would never have again. A pained expression crossed his face. "Elspeth, I cannot ask you to stay. This life, this land, it takes things. It took my wife. It took my son. It almost took you. To ask you to remain here, knowing what I could lose. It is more than I have a right to do." She stood and walked to stand before him, forcing him to meet her gaze. "You have been so determined to honor a debt to my father, a man who saved your life. But you have overlooked the truth of the last few months. I came here as a frightened girl bought and sold in an alley. I am not that person anymore. You gave me a sanctuary when I had none. You showed me a strength I didn't know I possessed. You may think you were simply repaying a debt, Josiah, but you saved my life too." Tears welled in her eyes, but she did not let them fall. "So let me ask you, not as part of any arrangement, not because of any debt, do you want me to go?" The question shattered his final defense. All the grief, the fear, and the tightly reined emotion of the past 5 years surfaced in his eyes. He reached out his calloused hand, gently cupping her cheek, his touch tender and full of wonder. "No," he whispered, his voice thick with a feeling he could no longer deny. "God help me, no. Staying here, it might be the most unthinkable thing of all. But the thought of you leaving is worse." He had done the unthinkable in that alley to save her life. He had done the unthinkable by forcing her into a marriage to protect her. Now he was doing the most unthinkable thing of all. He was allowing himself to hope, to feel, to love again. She leaned into his touch, a true, radiant smile finally breaking across her face. The gold band on her finger, once a symbol of her gilded cage, now felt warm against her skin. It was not the end of a transaction, but the seal on a new vow, one made, not before a judge, but in the crucible of fear and fire. It was a promise of a new beginning together, under the vast and watchful sky of the Arizona Territory. In the quiet aftermath, with the law summoned, and Thorne's empire crumbling under the weight of his crimes, a new dawn broke over the Blackwood Sterling Ranch. The marriage, once a cold, practical arrangement, had been reforged in the fires of conflict and conspiracy. It was no longer a shield against a threat, for the threat was gone. It was now a question. Josiah and Elspeth stood on the porch, watching the sun paint the horizon in hues of rose and gold. The air was finally clear. The debt of life was paid, the secret was out, and they were, for the first time, truly free. They were free to part ways, their strange contract fulfilled, or they were free to see the truth that had been forged between them, a bond of respect, courage, and a deep, unspoken care. The rancher's unthinkable act hadn't just been to save her, but to open a door in his own heart he thought was sealed forever. What do you think they chose? The West was a land of new beginnings, after all. If this story of grit survival and unexpected honor captured your imagination, please show your support. Hit that like button, share this tale with someone who loves a good old-fashioned drama, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel. We have so many more stories from the dusty trails and forgotten corners of history to share with you. Click that bell so you don't miss a single one. Thank you for listening.